When my daughter-in-law picked up my late wife's handmade quilt, looked me dead in the eyes, and dropped it into the trash can outside the back door, I understood something I had spent 3 years refusing to accept. She didn't see a family. She saw an asset. She had already hired a real estate agent to assess the lake house before I ever stepped foot on the porch that afternoon. I sold the property within 8 weeks, removed every heirloom my parents ever left me, and never spent another night under that roof. Before we get into how it all happened, please subscribe to the channel and drop a comment telling me what state you're watching from tonight. The drive up to Seneca Lake usually takes me about 4 hours from Philadelphia. I've made that drive so many times over the years that I barely think about it anymore. My father built the original structure on that property back in 1971. 3 bedrooms, a covered porch facing the water, a stone fireplace my grandfather helped him lay by hand. My mother planted the garden along the east side. She tended it every summer until she couldn't anymore. My wife Margaret and I brought our son Tyler there every July for 22 years. He took his first swim off that dock. He caught his first fish in that water. When Margaret passed 3 years ago after her long illness, the lake house was where I scattered her ashes, off the end of that dock at sunrise on a Tuesday morning in October, just the 2 of us and the fog coming off the water. I had spent the weeks before that October drive preparing what I thought was the most meaningful gift I could give my son. The property deed, transferred into his name, along with a letter I had written by hand explaining what the place meant to our family, what I hoped it would mean to his. Tyler and his wife had been staying at the lake house for nearly 3 years at that point. They'd moved in shortly after Margaret's funeral. Tyler called me from the driveway the day after we buried her. "Dad, things are a little tight right now financially. Amanda and I were thinking, if it's not too much trouble, maybe we could stay up at the lake house for a while, just to get our feet under us. 6 months, maybe a year at the most." I told him, of course. I told him to take as long as he needed. I told him it was family property, and family was what it was for. When I pulled into the gravel driveway that October afternoon, the first thing I noticed was the new truck, a black crew cab with chrome trim parked in front of the garage, a vehicle I had never seen before. The second thing I noticed was that my mother's garden was gone. Not neglected. Gone. Ripped out entirely. Black landscaping fabric covered the ground where her roses had grown for 30 years, held down with decorative stones in a pattern that meant nothing to anyone. My daughter-in-law opened the front door before I knocked. She was dressed in a way I had never seen her dress for a visit with me. Fitted blazer, jewelry I didn't recognize, a smile that arrived before it had any reason to. "Robert," she said, "you made good time. Come in, I just put on coffee." The inside of the house stopped me at the threshold. The furniture was different. My parents' oak pieces were gone, replaced with dark modern sectionals and glass-topped tables that reflected the ceiling light in a way that made the room feel like a showroom. My mother's curtains were down. Track lighting had been installed along the living room ceiling, which explained the screw holes I noticed in the original wood beam. Framed prints I had never seen hung where family photographs had been. Tyler appeared from the kitchen. He was thinner than I remembered. He moved differently. Something careful and compressed about the way he held himself. "Hey, Dad. Thanks for making the trip. Good to see you." We sat at the dining table, which was also new. My father had built the original out of white oak. I used to trace the grain with my finger as a child. This table was dark-stained composite, the kind that wipes clean and shows nothing. I set the manila envelope on the surface between us. I had driven 4 hours holding on to the feeling this moment was going to produce. Something earned and right. The continuation of a line that ran from my grandfather's hands to my father's to mine and now to my son's. "Tyler, Amanda," I began, "I want tonight to mean something." I opened the envelope and slid the deed across the table. "This property has been in our family for over 50 years. My father built it. My mother kept it. Margaret and I raised you here every summer, and now I want to pass it to you. Properly. Officially. I have an appointment with a real estate attorney in Geneva next month to complete the transfer." My daughter-in-law picked up the deed before Tyler could reach it. She scanned it quickly, set it down. "And what's the assessed value right now?" I blinked. I hadn't expected that to be the first question. The county assessed it at around $800,000 last year. Lakefront property in the Finger Lakes has appreciated quite a bit since my father's time. She leaned back. Our agent thinks we can get closer to 1.2 from the right buyer. Probably someone from the city looking for a weekend place. She glanced at Tyler. We've already had someone walk through. I looked at my son. He was looking at the table. Tyler. He cleared his throat. We've been talking about it for a while, Dad. The property is worth a lot more than what we could ever use it for personally. It makes more financial sense to sell it? I heard my own voice come out flat. My daughter-in-law stood up. She was already moving toward the back of the house as she talked. We've been here 3 years, Robert. 3 years maintaining this place. The furnace alone cost us $4,000 last winter. We've invested in this property. She opened the back door. And frankly, we've waited long enough. I don't know exactly what I said next because that was when she picked up the quilt. It was folded on the porch bench where I had left it the last time I visited. Margaret's grandmother had pieced it together in the 1940s. When we inherited it after Margaret's mother passed, Margaret spent 8 months having it professionally restored, paying a textile conservator in Bucks County to stabilize the fabric and repair the torn corners. She kept it in an archival box during the winter and brought it out each summer. The quilt was one of 4 things I had specifically asked them not to move when they first arrived. My daughter-in-law held it up with 2 fingers like she was handling something she found under a sink. She looked at it the way someone looks at something they have already decided to throw away. This has been sitting out here in the weather for months, she said. It's musty, and it's falling apart, and honestly, I don't know why it's still here. And she dropped it into the metal trash can beside the door. The lid came down with a hollow ring that bounced off the water and disappeared. Tyler hadn't moved. I looked at him across the length of the porch. He looked at his shoes. I walked to the trash can. I opened the lid. I lifted the quilt out with both hands and held it against my chest. I could smell the cedar from the box. Faint, but still there. I carried it back inside past both of them, past the new furniture and the track lighting, picked up the manila envelope from the table, and walked to my truck. I sat behind the wheel for a long time before I turned the key. The sun was dropping behind the western ridge. The lake went from silver to pewter. I watched the light change, and I thought about my father pouring the foundation in the summer of 1971. I thought about my mother on her knees in that garden. I thought about Margaret at the end of that dock on a Tuesday morning in October, and the way the fog sat on the water, and how quiet everything was. I thought about Tyler's shoes. The drive back to Philadelphia took longer than usual. I missed an exit somewhere north of Binghamton, and ended up on county roads for 40 minutes. I didn't mind. I needed the time. When I got home, I placed the quilt on the bed in the spare room, the way Margaret used to arrange it when her mother came to visit. I sat beside it in the dark for a while without turning on the light. Then I went to the kitchen and made a cup of coffee I didn't drink, and I sat at my table until 2 in the morning thinking about the same thing over and over. I had been a civil engineer for 33 years. I designed infrastructure for a living. I understood load distribution, structural integrity, the precise calculation of what a system could bear before it failed. I had been running this family arrangement on assumptions instead of calculations. That was my error. Not generosity. Bad engineering. I got up and found a legal pad. At the top I wrote, Property Seneca Lake. Beneath it I began listing every expense I had continued to pay since Tyler and Amanda moved in. Homeowner's insurance, $1,900. Utilities I paid remotely because the accounts were still in my name, roughly $6,000 annually across 3 years. The furnace they replaced, which I had reimbursed in full because Tyler sent me the invoice with a note that said, Can you cover this until we're more stable? The loan I wired Tyler 18 months ago, $28,000, described in his request as startup capital for a landscaping company that had apparently never opened. When I totaled the column, I stared at the number for several minutes. $61,400 over 3 years, not including the property value itself, which my daughter-in-law had already had assessed without telling me, and was now planning to liquidate the moment I signed the deed. I wasn't angry. Anger is a temporary condition. What I felt was closer to a calibration error being corrected. I flipped to a clean page and wrote 4 words at the top. What do I own? The deed was in my name. The tax records were in my name. The insurance policy listed me as sole owner. There was no lease, no rental agreement, no written arrangement of any kind. They had paid nothing, signed nothing, and claimed nothing formally except what they now apparently believed was a verbal promise I had made about eventual transfer. I had made no such promise. I had said it was family property, and family was what it was for. That was not a contract. That was a father talking to a son at a funeral. By 4 in the morning, I had a legal pad covered in notes and a clearer picture than I'd had in 3 years. I closed the pad, rinsed my coffee cup, and went to bed. I slept better than I expected. The next morning, I dressed the way I used to dress for project presentations. Oxford shirt, dark slacks, leather shoes. If I was going to treat this as a professional matter, I needed to carry myself accordingly. I had done work in the Finger Lakes region for most of my career, and I knew the legal community there reasonably well. The name Ellen Marsh had come up twice in the past few years. Once when a colleague sold property in Schuyler County, and once from a contractor who described her as someone who doesn't waste your time. I looked her up. Estate attorney in Watkins Glen, 20 years in practice. Her firm's website was direct. No marketing language. I called at 9 and had an appointment for Thursday. Her office was on the 2nd floor of a brick building 2 blocks off the main street. The waiting area had a window that looked down toward the lake. I noticed she had no decorative objects on the shelves, just organized files, reference books, and a framed engineering drawing of what looked like a bridge. She came out exactly on time. Early 50s, dark hair pulled back, firm handshake. Mr. Harmon, come in. I laid my documents on the desk in the order I had prepared them. Deed, tax receipts, insurance policy, utility statements, bank transfer records including the wire for $28,000, a spreadsheet with every line item totaled. I placed them one at a time the way I used to present project documentation to a review board. She examined the deed first. Sole ownership. No liens, no co-title. Correct. Inherited from my father. Never transferred or encumbered. She moved through the tax receipts, the utility bills. She looked at the spreadsheet for a long time without speaking. Then she looked up. How long have they occupied the property? 34 months as of this week. Any written agreement? Lease? Loan document? Written promise of transfer? Nothing written. The arrangement was verbal and understood to be temporary. She set down the spreadsheet. Mr. Harmon, under New York property law, your position is essentially unassailable. You hold sole title. There is no lease. Occupants without a formal tenancy agreement have no protected rights to remain once the owner decides otherwise. You can sell this property whenever you choose. I want to sell it before they know it's coming. Find a buyer, sign a contract, then serve notice. She considered that. It's legally sound. We serve a formal notice to vacate concurrent with the executed purchase agreement. 30 days minimum, which is standard. It doesn't give them leverage to delay the closing if the paperwork is clean. What do you charge for full representation through closing? She named a number. I nodded. We shook hands. I drove back to Philadelphia with a signed representation agreement and something I hadn't felt in weeks. Direction. The following week, I returned to the lake house on a Saturday morning. I had called Tyler and told him I needed to collect some personal items for insurance documentation purposes. He sounded uneasy, but agreed. He said Amanda would be out. She wasn't out. She was in the kitchen when I arrived, in a robe, drinking coffee, watching me from behind the counter without saying anything. Tyler met me at the door. I walked past both of them to the storage room off the back hallway. My parents had used it for overflow furniture and off-season items. It held things I had not thought about in years. My father's workbench tools, still in their original cases, a box of my mother's correspondence and journals dating back to the 1960s, 3 oil paintings Margaret had acquired from galleries over 20 years, the quilt box, which I had returned to the shelf after retrieving the quilt from the trash, a set of my grandfather's woodworking planes, still sharp, still wrapped in their original cloth. I photographed every item, multiple angles, Condition notes in a small notebook. Tyler appeared in the doorway partway through. Dad, what are you doing? Documenting my personal property. But why now? He paused. Is something happening? I looked at him directly. These items belong to our family, Tyler. Your grandfather's tools, your grandmother's paintings. They were never part of the house structure. They're mine, and I'm making sure that's documented. He stood in the doorway with his hands in his pockets, the way he used to stand as a teenager when he knew he had done something wrong but wasn't ready to admit it. You're not planning to take all of this, are you? I turned back to photographing. I said nothing. He left. After another minute, I heard his voice through the wall, low and urgent. Then my daughter-in-law's voice higher and harder. Then silence. I spent 2 hours on the inventory. When I finished, I carried the quilt box out to my truck and placed it carefully in the back seat. My daughter-in-law was standing on the porch when I came back for a second load. You're taking things out of our home, she said. I'm taking my belongings from my property. I'll provide a complete inventory. We'll see what our attorney says about that. Please do, I said. I have documentation for every item. I loaded the last box, said goodbye to neither of them, and drove away. In the rearview mirror, she was still standing on the porch. 2 weeks later, Ellen called. I have buyers. Retired couple from New Jersey, both in their early 60s, looking for a permanent lake property. They've been searching for 2 years. She walked them through last Tuesday, while your son was apparently at work. Cash offer, $980,000. Below the county assessment by a little, but no inspection contingency, and they want to close in 45 days. I said yes before she finished the sentence. I'll prepare the notice, she said. Your son will receive it by certified mail. He'll also need to acknowledge receipt in person. Do you want me to handle that directly? Yes. She paused briefly. How are you doing with all of this? Robert, honest question. I took a moment with it. I'm doing what needs to be done. I know. She was quiet for a second. That's not always the same as doing well. I know, I said. She said to call her if I needed to talk it through. Something in the steadiness of her voice made me think she meant it the way people mean something when they have actually been through something themselves, not as a professional courtesy. I called Catherine from upstairs that evening and arranged for her team to move the personal property out of the storage room the following Saturday. Then I dialed Tyler. He answered on the second ring. Dad. His voice was tighter than usual. I've been trying to reach you. I need to collect the remaining items from the storage room next Saturday. I'll have a truck there from 9 to noon. It would be better if you were both present to sign the inventory receipt. What's going on? What items? Dad, you're scaring me. Saturday at 9, Tyler. Please be there. I ended the call. My hand was steady. Saturday arrived overcast, a thin, cold light coming off the water. I reached the property at 8:40 and walked the perimeter for the first time in months. The dock was intact. The stone walkway my father laid was intact. The east bed where the garden had been was still covered in black landscaping fabric. I stood there for a moment looking at it. Ellen arrived at 9 exactly with a 3-person crew in a rental truck. Tyler and my daughter-in-law were both home. They stood in the doorway together when the truck pulled in. Tyler's face had aged since October. My daughter-in-law's face had not. She was already dressed as though she had somewhere to be. Ellen introduced herself and handed Tyler a 3-page inventory with photographs attached. Morning. We'll work quickly and carefully. This is the documented list of items we're removing. All personal property belonging to Mr. Harmon. Tyler held the pages with both hands and read through them slowly. His hands were not steady. My daughter-in-law moved past him. Those tools have been in that room for 30 years, she said to Ellen. They're part of this house. Ma'am. Ellen's voice was professional and entirely calm. Each item on that list is documented as personal property inherited by Mr. Harmon from his parents. None of it was ever part of the real estate transaction. He has full legal right to remove it. I'll call the police. You're welcome to. I have the documentation here, and Mr. Harmon has authorization for everything on this list. Ellen turned to the crew. Let's start with the workbench tools. Careful with the cases, they're original. The crew worked with a precision I hadn't expected, moving blankets on every surface. Archival wrapping on the fragile pieces, They moved my father's tools, my mother's paintings, the boxes of correspondence, the grandfather's planes, and finally the quilt box into the truck with the kind of care that made me realize Ellen had told them something about what they were handling. My daughter-in-law followed the crew through every room, her voice escalating with each trip to the truck. That painting has hung there for years. You're stripping this house. You're destroying a home. Tyler stood in the hallway and watched his grandmother's things being carried past him. He looked at me once. I held the look. He turned away. When the last item was loaded, I walked to Tyler. I held out a sealed envelope. Complete inventory. Everything documented, photographed, and witnessed. He took it. "Dad!" He stopped. Started again. "Why are you doing this?" I looked at my son. "A month ago, your wife threw your mother's grandmother's quilt into a trash can. You were standing right there. You didn't say a word." I was shocked. "You had a month after that to call, to say something, to take any responsibility at all." He said nothing. I turned and walked to my truck. Behind me, my daughter-in-law's voice rose into something raw and sharp. "You can't take those things. We'll sue you for every dollar. That property is ours. We earned it." I got in the truck and followed Ellen's van down the driveway without looking back. Ellen stored everything in a climate-controlled unit near her office in Watkins Glen. When the crew finished unloading, she locked the unit and handed me the key. Then she looked at me. "Coffee?" We drove separately to a small place 2 streets over that looked like it had been there since the 70s and had no intention of changing. Ellen ordered for both of us without asking, which should have seemed presumptuous, but somehow didn't. Black coffee and something with eggs. She set her hands on the table. "You did well today. You stayed composed." "Tyler just stood there," I said. "Again, I know." She looked at me directly. "My ex-husband stood there too. The day his brother said something about me that wasn't true, something genuinely ugly, and David just stood there. That silence is its own kind of betrayal. Sometimes it's the loudest thing in the room." "How long ago was that?" 7 years. She took a drink of her coffee. "I rebuilt. It took time, but I rebuilt." I studied her face. There was nothing performative about the way she said it. She was just describing facts from her own history the way she would describe the terms of a deed. "Why have you been so helpful?" I asked. "You could have kept this to the legal work." She was quiet for a moment. "Because you reminded me of myself at the beginning of that process. Clear about what you needed to do. Not clear yet about whether you'd survive doing it." I hadn't eaten much in weeks. I ate everything on the plate. 3 weeks after the move, Ellen called on a Wednesday evening. Tyler and his wife vacated voluntarily on December 18th, 4 days before the deadline. Ellen's voice was measured. "The buyers are ready to close on the 22nd. Come sign." Dawn. Dawn. I drove up on the morning of the 22nd. The lake was frozen in a thin shelf out from the shore. The house looked the same from the outside as it had the day my father finished building it. I stood at the end of the driveway for a few minutes before going in. The closing was in Ellen's office. The buyers were a pleasant couple, both retired teachers from Somerset County. They asked me questions about the dock and the furnace and the history of the property. I answered all of them. When the transfer was complete and the wire confirmation appeared on Ellen's screen, the husband shook my hand with both of his. "We'll take good care of it." "I know you will," I said. That afternoon, I drove to my estate attorney's office in Philadelphia. I had an appointment I had scheduled 8 weeks earlier. We sat across from each other with my current will on the desk between us. She looked at me. "Are you certain about this, Robert? Tyler is your only child." "Yes." I removed my son as beneficiary. In his place, I designated 2 recipients. The Veterans Legal Aid Clinic I had started volunteering with 2 months earlier, and Ellen Marsh. When my attorney looked up, I explained. The clinic, because it was work I had come to believe in. Ellen, because when everyone around me was evaluating what I was worth, she was the only one who treated me like a person. January was cold and quiet. I began volunteering at the clinic 2 mornings a week. I sat across from elderly veterans who were being pressured to sign documents they didn't understand, being maneuvered out of properties by people they trusted. I knew the terrain. I could explain the law in plain language. I could tell them what they actually owned and what they didn't have to give away. An 81-year-old man sat across from me one afternoon. His stepson had been asking him to put the house in both their names. For tax purposes, he said. He seemed embarrassed to be suspicious of his own family. Trust that instinct, I told him. What you're describing is a transfer of ownership under a different name, but he says it won't change anything for me. If it doesn't change anything, there's no reason to do it. He nodded. He left with his documents in order. Ellen and I had dinner most Thursdays. She drove down to Philadelphia twice. I drove up to Watkins Glen on weekends when the weather allowed. We walked along the lake in February in heavy coats, talking about things that had nothing to do with property law. She told me about her daughter, who was finishing her residency in Pittsburgh. She told me about a trip she had taken to Maine after the divorce, alone, in a rented cabin, and how it had been the first time she felt like herself again. I told her about Margaret, about the good years and the hard ones, and the October morning on the dock. She listened the way people listen when they have their own version of the same grief. One evening in late February, she was sitting in my kitchen while I made dinner, and she looked out the window toward the street for a long time. I asked her what she was thinking. I spent a long time deciding not to be surprised by people anymore, she said. And then you walked in. I didn't say anything. I kept my eyes on what I was cooking because I didn't trust what my face might do. She stayed until nearly midnight that night. When she left, she paused at the door. Robert. Yes, you should know. I haven't been this comfortable with someone in a long time. I stood in the doorway after her car pulled away. The street was empty and cold and very quiet, and I felt something I had not felt in enough time that it took me a moment to identify it correctly. It was a simple feeling. I was glad to be where I was. In early March, an email arrived from Tyler. I almost deleted it without reading it. Then I didn't. Dad, I don't know if you'll read this. I wouldn't blame you if you didn't. I've spent the last 3 months in therapy, and the first thing my therapist asked me was when did I stop defending myself. I couldn't answer. I let Amanda make every decision for so long that I stopped knowing what I actually thought about anything. When she threw Mom's quilt away, I told myself she didn't understand what it meant. But I understood, and I didn't say anything. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I know I don't have the right to ask that. But I want you to know that I understand now what I did and what I failed to do. Whatever you decide, I hope you're well. I love you, Tyler. I read it twice. Then I put my phone in my pocket and drove to Ellen's office. She read it at her desk while I stood at the window looking out toward the water. When she finished, she looked at me. What do you feel? Several things at once. I thought about it. Sad that it took this. And something else. Relieved that he's not entirely gone. What will you do? I typed on my phone while she watched me. Tyler, I read your email. I'm glad you're working with someone. What you're describing takes real effort, and I don't dismiss that. But I need to be honest with you. The way I understand family changed after October. I'm no longer a man who absorbs damage quietly and keeps giving. If you're changing, change for yourself. Not to recover what we had, or what you think you might stand to receive from me. If there's something real to rebuild someday, it will take time, and it will take evidence, not words. Be well. Take care of yourself. Dad. I pressed send and put the phone back in my pocket. Ellen was watching me. That was exactly right. We drove out to Seneca Lake that afternoon even though there was no reason to. The new owners had moved in the previous month. The property looked cared for. The dock was still there. The stone walkway my father laid, even the weathered pine on the north face that my father had never gotten around to repainting. A light was on in the back room, which I remembered was the room Tyler had used as a child. I stood at the edge of the road for a moment. Ellen stood beside me. All right? She asked. I thought about my father building something out of nothing on a piece of land by the water, and what it means to hand something like that forward. And what it means when the person you handed it to doesn't understand what they're holding. Yes, I said. I think so. She put her hand in mine, and we walked back to the car. The lake was pale and flat under a March sky, and the bare trees along the ridge were just beginning to show a faint color, the earliest suggestion that the season was changing. that what looked finished was only resting, that the cold and the quiet and the long gray winter were not the end of the story. I had spent 33 years building things designed to bear weight. Bridges and overpasses and the underpinnings of roads that other people drove on without thinking about what was underneath, holding everything up. I understood load-bearing. I understood the difference between a structure that looked stable and one that actually was. What I had built in the last 4 months was something I had not planned and could not have engineered, but it held. More than held. It was the first thing in years that felt like it had been built correctly, from the foundation up, by people who knew exactly what they were doing. I squeezed Ellen's hand. She squeezed back. That was enough. If this story moved you in any way, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who might need to hear it. To listen to the next story, click the box on the right. Thank you for being here tonight.